My name is Samuel Thorne, and for the better part of 40 years, my life's compass has had only one true north: serve God. It was a purpose I believed to be as simple and profound as breathing. For decades, I had stood in pulpits, knelt in hospital rooms, and walked dusty roads in faraway lands, all in an effort to bring his message of love to anyone who would listen. I saw myself as a vessel, a simple conduit for a divine current, and I tried with every fiber of my being to live the way the Gospels taught us. But the truth, the one I kept buried even from myself, was that the vessel was growing tired. It was starting to crack. Nothing could have prepared me for the night that vessel shattered completely. It was a Sunday evening in late autumn, the kind of day that feels like a final golden breath before the long sleep of winter. I had just concluded a service at a small countryside chapel just outside of town. The old building, with its creaking pews and scent of aged wood and candle wax, had been overflowing with life that morning. The congregation, a tapestry of weathered farmers, young families, and elderly widows, had been on fire. They sang with the kind of unrestrained joy that could shake the heavens, their prayers rising like incense in the slanted afternoon light. It was a powerful service, one of those rare moments where the veil between worlds feels impossibly thin. It left me feeling energized, yes, but it was a brittle energy, like a wire pulled too taut. I felt the familiar hum of accomplishment, the quiet satisfaction of having done something meaningful. As I locked the heavy oak doors behind me, the last of the parishioners having driven off, a profound silence descended. It was just me, my old sedan, and the vast, painted sky. I got into the car, the worn leather of the driver's seat sighing under my weight, and for a moment I just sat there. My mind replayed the closing words of my sermon, the very cornerstone of my faith: love one another as I have loved you. The words felt smooth and polished from a lifetime of use, yet as I sat in that growing twilight, a strange thought surfaced, unbidden and unwelcome. But have you, Samuel? Have you really? I pushed it down, dismissing it as the weariness of a long day. I was tired, that was all. The engine turned over with a familiar rumble, and I pulled onto the empty two-lane road, ready for the quiet drive home. The road stretched ahead, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through fields of harvested corn, the last embers of sunset bleeding across the horizon in hues of orange and deep violet. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of damp earth and wood smoke. It was the kind of air that makes you roll the windows down just a sliver, to feel its cool, sharp kiss on your face. I did just that, the rush of it feeling like a cleansing. I was trying to wash away that lingering, unsettling question. To fill the silence, I turned on the radio, fiddling with the dial until it landed on a station playing old gospel hymns. The gentle, wavering voice of a woman singing, "His eye is on the sparrow," filled the car. It was a song my mother used to sing to me as a child, a melody steeped in the innocence of a faith that had not yet been tested by the complexities and compromises of adult life. A genuine smile touched my lips. In that moment, everything felt right. The powerful sermon, the quiet beauty of the drive, the nostalgic song, it all clicked together into a portrait of a life well lived, a day perfectly concluded. I felt a sense of peace settle over me, a feeling of closure, as if a great and important chapter of my life had just been written. I took a deep, satisfying breath, believing it was the breath of a man at peace with his God and his work. I had no way of knowing it was the last peaceful breath I would ever take. It began as a ghost of a sensation, a faint pressure behind my breastbone, no more alarming than a bout of indigestion after a rich meal. I shifted in my seat, taking a slow, deep breath to settle what I assumed was a trivial discomfort. Too much coffee after the service, Samuel, I chided myself. But the pressure didn't recede. Instead, it held its ground, and then, with a chilling deliberation, it began to tighten. It was no longer a dull ache, it was a fist, clenching around my heart, squeezing with a cold, methodical strength. I tried to take another breath, but my lungs snagged, able to draw only a shallow, unsatisfying gasp of air. Within seconds, the fist became something else, something alive. It felt like a cold serpent coiling in my chest, its thick muscles constricting with a grinding, inexorable force. A new sensation, a terrifying electrical fire, ignited in the center of the clench and shot down my left arm, a jagged line of agony that made my fingers curl into a useless claw on the steering wheel. The hymn on the radio, the sweet and comforting "His Eye is on the Sparrow," began to sound strange, the singer's voice seeming to warp and slow, each note stretching into a mournful, mocking drone. My vision began to swim. The vibrant sunset outside the windshield dissolved into a meaningless smear of bleeding colors. A wave of dizziness, so profound it felt as though the world had tilted on its axis, slammed into me. I gripped the wheel, my knuckles white, the worn leather the only solid thing in a universe that was rapidly coming apart. The serpent in my chest tightened its coils again, harder this time, and a cold sweat broke out across my entire body, drenching my shirt in an instant. The empty road, once a symbol of peace, now felt like an endless, lonely path to oblivion. And then through the fog of pain and confusion, a single horrifying word of diagnosis formed in my mind: heart attack. The moment the word landed, pure animal panic erupted in my throat, a scream that I couldn't release. It was a raw, primal terror that had nothing to do with faith or God or the assurance of heaven. It was the desperate cry of the flesh, raging against its own extinction. "Stay calm, Samuel, just pull over, pray." I tried to command my body, but my commands were lost in transit. I ordered my foot to ease off the accelerator, but it felt like a lead weight. I tried to steer the car toward the shoulder of the road, but my fingers, slick with sweat, refused to cooperate. They were no longer my own. My heart, the very organ under siege, began to betray me in a new way. It was no longer beating, it was thrashing, a wild, frantic bird trapped in the cage of my ribs, slamming itself against the bars in a chaotic, useless rhythm. The air was thick, impossible to breathe. The warped gospel song on the radio was now just a discordant hum beneath the deafening roar of blood in my ears. I could feel the car beginning to drift, veering slowly, inevitably, toward the ditch on the side of the road. I was no longer a driver, I was a passenger in a dying machine. My hands slipped from the wheel. My foot went limp on the gas pedal. My head, impossibly heavy, fell forward. One final, desperate thought flickered in the darkness of my mind: God, help me. And then the thrashing in my chest gave one last, violent convulsion. And stopped. The world did not fade. It did not dim. It was simply gone. The pain, the panic, the sound, the light, all of it was extinguished in an instant, as if a switch had been flipped on my entire existence. There was only a silent, profound, and absolute darkness. The darkness was not a void. It was a state of being, a complete absence of sensory input, yet I was aware. There was no confusion, no slow-dawning horror of what had just occurred. One moment I was Samuel Thorne, dying in a car. The next I simply was. And I was not in the car. I don't remember the moment the tires left the asphalt or the sickening crunch of metal against wood. I have no memory of the impact, the screech of protesting steel, or the shattering of glass. None of it registered in the silent, timeless space I now occupied. All I knew was that I was no longer bound by the flesh and bone that had defined my existence for 63 years. I was above it all, floating, weightless, like a mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam. Below me, nestled in a shallow ditch, was my car. It had come to rest against the thick, unyielding trunk of an ancient oak tree, the front end crumpled like a discarded piece of paper. The engine was still humming, a soft, incongruous purr in the otherwise silent twilight, and through the shattered driver's side window, I could still hear the faint, ghostly strains of that same gospel song, now a requiem for a life just ended. Slumped over the steering wheel, head bowed as if in prayer, was my own body. I saw the familiar tweed jacket, the slightly thinning gray hair, the hand that had held my wife's for 40 years, now limp and lifeless. I observed the scene with a strange, clinical detachment, a profound sense of disidentification. That was not me. That was a vessel, a suit of clothes I had just stepped out of. The strangest part, the part that my living mind would have rejected as impossible, was the utter absence of fear. There was no pain, no panic, no desperate struggle for survival. All the terror of the final moments was gone, washed away by a current of absolute peace. It was a peace more profound than any I had ever experienced, deeper than the quietest prayer, more complete than the most serene moment of meditation. It was as if the immense, crushing weight of the world, every worry, every regret, every ambition, every unfinished task, had been lifted from my soul in an instant. There was just stillness, a serene and luminous silence. As I hovered there, unmoored from time, I witnessed a pair of headlights approaching from down the road. The car slowed as it neared the accident, its occupants clearly seeing my vehicle half hidden in the ditch. I felt a flicker of something, not hope, but a vestige of earthly expectation. The car pulled almost to a stop, idling for a long moment. I could feel the debate happening within it, the conflict between civic duty and the desire not to get involved. Then, with a sudden burst of acceleration, the car sped away, its red taillights shrinking into the darkness until they were gone. The act should have felt like a final abandonment, a confirmation of my isolation. Instead, it only deepened the sense of peace. I was beyond their help now. I was beyond all earthly concerns. The world and its dramas were fading, becoming a play I was no longer a part of. And in that growing distance, as the last ties to my old life frayed and snapped, I felt something behind me. It wasn't a sound or a sight, but a presence. A warmth and awareness. I turned not with a physical body, but with my very consciousness. And that's when I saw it. It began as a pinprick in the fabric of the twilight world, a single point of luminance that was somehow brighter than the memory of the sun. But it was not a light that my eyes could have seen. It was a light perceived directly by my soul. It didn't cast shadows or illuminate the landscape below me. Instead, it illuminated me, shining not on me but into me, exposing every hidden corner of my being with its gentle, insistent glow. This was not the light of a star or a lamp or any fire known to man. Those are pale, sterile imitations. This light was alive, breathing with a slow, cosmic rhythm that resonated with the very core of my consciousness. It expanded steadily, not like an explosion, but like a flower unfurling its petals in a time-lapsed eternity. The warmth that radiated from it was more than just a temperature, it was an emotion. It was the feeling of a mother's embrace, the comfort of a hearth fire on a winter's night, the relief of a cool drink on a sweltering day, all distilled into a single, perfect sensation. It was safety. It was acceptance. It was a profound and unshakable sense of homecoming that made my entire 63 years on Earth feel like a brief, confusing journey away from this one true place. The light had a texture like liquid gold and a sound, like a silent, celestial choir that vibrated within me rather than striking my ears. And it was intelligent. As it grew, filling my awareness, I understood that this was not some abstract cosmic phenomenon. It was a consciousness, a personality of infinite depth, and its attention was focused entirely on me. I felt known, not just seen or observed, but known in a way no human being could ever know another. It knew Samuel Thorne not as a pastor or a husband or a father, but as a soul, and it knew every failure, every secret pride, every doubt I had ever harbored. And in the face of that total exposure, the light communicated only one thing: a love so complete, so unconditional, that it simply didn't care about my imperfections. They were irrelevant. A pull emanated from it, a gentle yet irresistible current drawing me away from the wreck of my life below. It wasn't a force I could have fought, but more importantly, it was a force I had no desire to fight. Every part of me yearned for it, longed to dissolve into its warmth. It was an invitation, and to accept it, I had to let go of the last frayed threads tethering me to the world, the name, the memories, the identity I had spent a lifetime building. I let it all fall away. As I surrendered, the vast, impersonal radiance began to coalesce, to take on a form that my soul could comprehend. The light was no longer just a source, it was a being. The love was no longer just a feeling, it was a person. And in that final, breathtaking instant before I was completely enveloped, the last piece of understanding clicked into place, a truth so simple and so absolute it was a wonder I hadn't known it all along. This wasn't just light. This was him. In that moment, I knew I was about to meet Jesus. I opened the eyes of my soul, but I was no longer in my car. nor on the lonely road, nor even in the world I had known. I was in the light, and the light was in me. There was no sensation of standing or floating. The very concept of a physical body seemed like a distant, primitive memory. I simply existed as a point of pure awareness in an infinite ocean of what I can only call love. It was not the love we speak of on earth, which is a mere shadow, a fleeting echo. This was the source itself. It was the very fabric of this reality, the medium through which all existence flowed. Every particle of this place was composed of it, and to breathe it in was to be filled with a sense of wholeness, so complete it healed wounds I never knew I had. And standing before me, formed from the heart of that living radiance, was him. I didn't need to ask his name. To be in his presence was to know him. He was not the placid, two-dimensional figure from Sunday school paintings. His form was both definite and fluid, woven from light and compassion. In his eyes, I saw the birth of galaxies and the intimate sorrow of a single sparrow falling to the ground. He was a being of such galactic, terrifying power that he held nebulae in place, yet he exuded a humility so profound, so gentle, that it shattered my own pride into a million pieces. My spiritual knees buckled. It was not a conscious act of worship or a gesture of reverence. It was an involuntary, irresistible response to holiness, like iron filings aligning to a magnet. Before I could even form a thought, I was prostrate, not out of fear, but because my entire being recognized that I was in the presence of the source of my own existence. And as I knelt, he looked at me. And in that look, I was utterly and completely seen. In a single, timeless instant, my entire life was laid bare. It wasn't a film playing on a screen. It was an experience of total, immersive empathy. I didn't just see my mistakes, I was made to feel their impact from the perspective of those I had affected. I felt the sharp sting of humiliation in a young parishioner's heart when I had been dismissive of his questions. I felt the wave of loneliness that washed over my wife on the nights I had chosen the work of my ministry over the work of our marriage. I experienced the quiet, gnawing resentment of a fellow pastor whom I had judged for his different style of worship. Every failure, every doubt, every sin of omission and commission, I was made to drink the bitter cup of its consequences. But it was not a punishment, because for every painful memory, I was also shown the moments of grace. I felt the sudden warmth that blossomed in the chest of a homeless man to whom I'd given my coat on a freezing night, an act I had long forgotten. I experienced the surge of hope a grieving widow felt when I sat with her in silence, offering not empty platitudes, but simply my presence. He showed me that the smallest, most hidden acts of love sent out ripples that echoed through eternity, while my grandest, most public sermons were often just the hollow clang of a gong. He saw all of it, the beautiful, the ugly, the holy, the profane, and his eyes held not a flicker of judgment. There was only a deep, endless, and heartbreakingly pure compassion. When the last ripple of my life had settled, I was left feeling utterly transparent, stripped of every pretense and self-delusion. I had nothing to offer, nothing to hide behind. And it was only then, in that state of complete humility, that he spoke. His voice was not a sound that traveled through the air. It was a presence that bloomed directly in the center of my soul, a communication of pure thought and feeling that was warmer than light and clearer than water. Samuel, the presence resonated within me, filling me with a love that was both personal and infinite. You are not supposed to come yet, but there is something you must see. He extended his hand toward me, a gesture that was both a comfort and a command. The moment my consciousness touched his, the universe around us shifted. It was not travel as we understand it. There was no sense of velocity or distance being covered. It was more like the world of light was rearranging itself around his will, as if we were the still point in a flowing, cosmic river. The pure, undifferentiated ocean of love began to take on form and structure. In the far distance, a light that was somehow brighter than the light surrounding us began to resolve itself into a city. Calling it a city is a disservice, a failure of human language. It was not made of brick or steel or any earthly substance. It was composed of reality itself, woven from the very essence of joy. The structures that rose to impossible heights were not built, but sung into existence, their spires and arches the physical manifestation of 1 billion years of praise. They shimmered with colors my eyes had never seen, hues that seemed to have their own emotional weight, a blue that felt like perfect serenity, a gold that was the embodiment of wisdom, a crystalline white that was the pure essence of holiness. A river of what looked like liquid diamonds flowed through the city's heart, and I understood instinctively that it was not water, but a current of shared, joyous memories flowing from the heart of God. As we drew closer, the air itself changed. The original script of my life had taught me that air was a mixture of gases, but here, the air was life itself. Every spiritual breath I took was an infusion of strength, clarity, and a bliss so potent it bordered on pain. It purged the last vestiges of earthly weariness from my soul, making me feel lighter, stronger, and more truly myself than I had ever been. Then I saw the people, the inhabitants of this impossible place. They were numberless, a vast and joyous multitude, yet there was no sense of crowding. Each soul had its own space, its own unique luminescence, and they moved with a grace that was a form of worship. Their faces were bright with a peace that surpassed all understanding, their laughter echoing not as sound, but as cascades of light. Though I recognized none of them by earthly appearance, their souls were familiar to me. It was like meeting family members I had never known, but had always longed for. But then, among the radiant crowd, I recognized a specific spirit. Not by face, but by a familiar flicker of light, a unique spiritual signature. It was a young man from my parish who, years ago, had taken his own life. The memory of his funeral, the grief of his parents, and my own nagging sense of failure had been a quiet sorrow I carried for years. But here he was, whole and healed. The confusion and pain that had clouded his earthly eyes were gone, replaced by a radiant serenity. He saw me and he didn't need words. His spirit communicated a wave of love, forgiveness, and gratitude that washed over me, healing a wound I hadn't realized was still so raw. A short distance from him, I recognized another soul, an elderly woman from a brief mission trip to Kenya. We had shared no words, only a smile and a cup of water, but in that small act, our spirits had connected. Here, that connection was a visible, shining thread between us. She was no longer frail or poor, but a queen in her own right, robed in dignity and light. I was seeing the truth: in heaven, no connection is ever lost, and no love is ever wasted. I wanted to cry not from sadness, but from an overwhelming, crushing beauty. This was the world as it was meant to be. This was home. As I observed the inhabitants of that luminous city, I began to understand the mechanics of their joy. They communicated, but not with words that could be twisted or misunderstood. It was a flowing, seamless exchange of soul to soul, a pure telepathy of spirit where thoughts, feelings, and entire lifetimes of experience could be shared in an instant. There were no secrets, for there was nothing to hide. There was no deception, for truth was the air they breathed. Every interaction was perfectly transparent, perfectly loving, perfectly known. They embraced, and in that joining of light, they weren't just hugging. They were momentarily merging, sharing the fullness of their being with one another in an act of complete and selfless love. I saw a soul who I recognized from my earthly studies as a brutal Roman centurion standing side by side with a soul who had been a Christian martyr, their hands clasped not in truce, but in the deepest bonds of brotherhood. Their light intertwined, creating a new, more beautiful pattern. I saw a slave from the American South in a deep, loving communion with the man who had once been his master, all earthly hierarchies dissolved into the perfect equality of redeemed souls. There was no bitterness, no jealousy, no memory of pain, because in the economy of heaven, love is the only currency, and forgiveness is the bedrock of all existence. Jesus turned to me, his face calm, but his eyes holding the ancient weight of a creator, observing his creation. His voice resonated within my soul once more. "This is what was intended," he communicated. "This is the original design, the unbroken covenant." The unbroken covenant. The words settled into me, and with them, a devastating clarity. The design was love. The covenant was to live within that love, to reflect it, to be a part of its eternal, creative flow. And humanity, in its fearful pride, had shattered it. I wanted to cry not from the beauty around me, but from the searing pain of knowing what we had lost, what we had thrown away. Every border drawn on a map, every flag planted in soil, every angry word spoken in a family dispute, every theological argument that divided a church, each one was a hammer blow against this perfect, original design. We had built our own walls, created our own hierarchies, and invented our own tribes, all in a desperate attempt to find an identity that had been ours from the beginning in Him. We had chosen selfishness over unity, power over service, and judgment over the simple, terrifying, liberating call to love. The joy of heaven, which seconds before had filled me with ecstasy, now served as a painful mirror, reflecting the grotesque distortion of our world. I stood in the answer to every human prayer, the solution to every war, the cure for every ounce of suffering, and my soul ached with the knowledge that the world I had just left behind continued to choose the disease. I didn't need to ask Jesus why we had lost this. I knew. We had been given a masterpiece, and we had chosen to finger paint over it in shades of gray. The beauty of what was meant to be was an agony to behold, because I now understood with perfect clarity the ugliness of what we had made instead. As I stood there, suspended between the ecstasy of heaven's perfection and the agony of earth's reality, I felt the focus of Jesus' presence narrow and intensify upon me. His face, which had been a portrait of serene love, began to change. The love did not vanish. I understood now that it was the constant, the very foundation of his being, but it was now filtered through a new, heartbreaking expression. His eyes, still holding all the compassion of eternity, grew serious. His gentle features were etched with something far deeper than human sadness. It was a divine sorrow, a cosmic grief that was both ancient and immediate. It was the sorrow of a master architect watching his perfect design being willfully dismantled, the sorrow of a father watching his children choose suffering over the safety of his embrace. It was the pain that is only possible when infinite love beholds profound brokenness. The atmosphere around us responded to his shift in emotion. The light of the celestial city did not dim or fade, but its quality, its very frequency, changed. The vibrant, celebratory colors became muted and solemn. The symphony of joy that had resonated through my soul shifted into a somber, minor key, a lament that echoed with the cries of a billion lost souls. I felt his sorrow as if it were my own, a wave of empathy so powerful it threatened to dissolve me. It was a grief that contained every act of cruelty, every bitter tear, every lonely death in the history of the world. A part of me, the part that had just tasted perfection, wanted to recoil, to scream, to beg to stay in the warmth and joy of the unbroken covenant. To leave this place felt like a second death, a willing exile from paradise. But one look into his sorrowful eyes silenced my fear. I trusted him completely. His was not the anger of a disappointed judge, but the aching heart of a savior. I knew with a certainty that transcended all logic that whatever he was about to show me was not a punishment, but a necessary, agonizing lesson. There is something else you must see, he communicated, and his voice now carried the full weight of that divine ache. The words were not a suggestion, they were a statement of profound necessity. And suddenly the world around us began to shift again. The laughter, the embraces, the radiant joy of the city of light started to recede, not vanishing, but becoming distant, like watching a beloved shore disappear as your ship is pulled out to a dark and stormy sea. I felt myself being drawn downward, not falling, but descending through layers of reality, moving from the pristine truth of heaven toward the clouded, painful truth of the world I had left behind. The peace and love were still there, a comforting presence at my back, but I was now facing a very different reality. I steeled my soul, knowing that to truly understand the light, one must first be willing to witness the full depth of the darkness that rejects it. Whatever he was about to show me, I needed to see. The descent ended not with a gentle landing, but with a violent collision of realities. The harmonic peace of heaven was shattered, replaced by a cacophony of pure dissonance. Before me, a vision bloomed, but I was not watching it on a screen. I was in it. The ground beneath my spiritual feet was the cracked and broken pavement of a city street. The air, once pure life, was now thick with the acrid, choking stench of smoke, cordite, and something coppery and sweet that my soul recognized as spilled blood. The sky was a bruised, sickly orange, scarred by plumes of black smoke rising from the skeletal remains of buildings. This was not a vision of war, it was the living, breathing heart of it. Then the perspective shifted with a sickening lurch. I was no longer a detached observer standing beside Jesus. I was suddenly small, huddled behind a crumbling concrete wall, the rough texture of it scraping my cheek. I was looking through the eyes of a little girl, no older than 7. I could feel her small heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Her world was reduced to the deafening, high-pitched whistle of an incoming mortar shell, followed by an earth-shattering explosion that sent a tremor through her tiny bones and shook dust from the ceiling above. I felt her terror, a pure, uncomprehending horror that had no capacity for politics or ideology. She was simply a child, and her world was being torn apart. In the blink of an eye, I was ripped from her consciousness and thrown into another. I was taller now, the world viewed through the narrow slit of a helmet. My hands were clammy around the cold, heavy steel of a rifle. I was a young man, barely 18, his body flooded with a toxic cocktail of adrenaline and fear. But beneath the fear was something uglier, a manufactured, burning hatred for the enemy, shadowy figures he had been trained to kill without question. I felt the hatred as a bitter, metallic taste in my mouth. I saw a fleeting movement in a shattered doorway across the street, and through the boy's eyes, I raised the rifle. I felt his finger tighten on the trigger, the sickening recoil, the deafening crack of the shot. I experienced the horrifying, soul-numbing emptiness of extinguishing a life I had never even seen. The scene shifted again, and this was the worst of all. I was now kneeling in the rubble, my awareness merged with that of a mother. Her scream was not a sound but a physical force, a ragged, primal howl torn from the deepest part of her soul. In her arms was the limp, dust-covered body of her son, the very child whose terror I had just inhabited. I was no longer seeing her grief, I was drowning in it. It was a bottomless black ocean of loss so absolute that it created a void in my own spirit, an emptiness that no amount of love or light, it seemed, could ever fill. It was the pain of a torn universe, the ultimate violation of the creative impulse. Then, as quickly as it began, the immersion receded. I was myself again, standing beside Jesus on that street of sorrows. The screams, the explosions, the hatred, the grief, it all still swirled around me, but I was once again an observer. Yet I had been changed. The abstract concept of war had been burned away, replaced by the intimate, searing wounds I now carried in my own soul. It was no longer a headline or a statistic. It was the taste of dust and fear in a little girl's mouth, the cold weight of a rifle in a young boy's hands, and the infinite, crushing emptiness in a mother's arms. The hellscape of war dissolved, its screams fading into an unnerving silence. The rubble and smoke were replaced by a scene of pristine, manicured beauty, yet the feeling of wrongness, of profound spiritual sickness, only intensified. We were now standing outside the soaring walls of a modern palace, a fortress of glass and white stone. Inside, through vast windows, I could see people draped in fine fabrics, surrounded by art and technology that would have staggered a king. But Jesus allowed me to see beyond the surface, to perceive the state of their souls. They were not celebrants in a palace, they were prisoners in golden cages. Each opulent possession was another bar on their cell, each layer of wealth another insulator, cutting them off from true human connection. I could feel their inner worlds, a landscape of gnawing anxiety, deep boredom, and a terrifying, unspoken fear that all of it could be taken away. They were starving to death in a feast of plenty. Then the vision sharpened, splitting my perception into a sickening duality. On one side, I was inside that palace, at a banquet table groaning under the weight of a dozen exquisite dishes. I saw people taking delicate bites, photographing the food with their devices, their faces masks of performative pleasure. Half-eaten plates were whisked away, destined for the trash. The air was thick with hollow laughter and meaningless conversation. Simultaneously, I was on the other side of the wall, in a dusty, forgotten alley. I was inside the body of a small boy with stick-thin limbs and a painfully bloated belly, his hollow eyes scanning a pile of refuse. I felt the gnawing, acidic ache of true hunger in my own stomach, a pain so all-consuming it blotted out all other thought. I felt the boy's surge of desperate hope as he found a discarded piece of bread, and the contrast between his raw survival and the casual waste I was witnessing on the other side of the wall struck me with the force of a physical blow. The vision expanded, moving from individual indulgence to the vast, impersonal machinery of greed. I was plunged into the consciousness of a man in a skyscraper boardroom, a titan of industry. I felt his mind sharp and cold as polished steel as he signed a document. I felt his justification, the clean logic of profit margins and shareholder value, as he approved a measure that would poison a river thousands of miles away, destroying the livelihood of an entire community of people he would never see. I felt no malice in him, no mustache-twirling villainy, only a chilling, profound emptiness, a spiritual black hole that he desperately tried to fill with numbers on a screen. Then I was on the receiving end of his signature. I was a father standing on the banks of that now-dead river, the stench of chemicals filling my nostrils, looking at the barren fields that could no longer feed my family. I felt his despair, his rage, and most terribly, his powerlessness. He was not a person to the man in the skyscraper. He was an externality, a rounding error. He was a victim of a system designed to benefit the few at the cost of the many, a system built not on overt hatred, but on the far more insidious foundation of indifference. I turned my soul to Jesus, my being screaming a silent question: how can you stand this? His presence beside me was a tempest of sorrowful love. Look closer, Samuel, he communicated, turning my gaze back to the man in the golden cage, the CEO in his sterile office. For the first time, I saw him not as an oppressor, but as a soul in the final stages of starvation. His power was his prison. His wealth was his disease. He was just as trapped, just as lost, as the father by the poisoned river. Both were victims of a world that had forgotten the simple, devastating truth. A man's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions, but in the abundance of his love. The vision of the golden cages and poisoned rivers dissolved, and for a fleeting, foolish moment, a sliver of pastoral pride surfaced within me. The world was broken, yes, but surely the church, my church, the body of Christ, was the sanctuary, the hospital for these wounded souls. We were the ones holding back the darkness. But the sorrow radiating from Jesus deepened, and I knew with a dreadful certainty that the worst was yet to come. The scene shifted again, and this time the vision was a cruel mockery of my earthly comfort. We were standing in the fellowship hall of my own church. I saw it all with perfect clarity: the familiar beige walls, the slightly stained carpet, the long tables where we held potlucks. I saw the faces of my flock, people I had baptized, married, and prayed with for decades. I saw Martha, our head deaconess, pouring coffee, her face a mask of pious service. She was standing with two other women from the prayer committee, and as they smiled and stirred sugar into their cups, Jesus allowed me to hear not their spoken words, but the true intent of their hearts. They were discussing a young couple in the church whose marriage was failing. Their words were cloaked in the language of concern and prayer, but beneath the surface, I felt the sickening, self-righteous thrill of gossip, the subtle pride of judging another's struggle, the cheap grace they offered themselves by dissecting someone else's sin. As I perceived this hypocrisy, a new sensation assaulted me, a sound. It was a low, grating, discordant hum, like 1,000 out-of-tune instruments playing at once. It was spiritually deafening, and I understood that this was the sound of a house divided, the sound of prayers offered with unclean hearts, a noise so foul it drowned out their hymns of praise. The vision then pulled me into the main sanctuary during a Sunday service just a few weeks prior. I was forced to watch myself in the pulpit, preaching with passion about the radical, welcoming love of God. As my own voice echoed in the room, the main doors at the back creaked open. A young woman stood there, hesitant. She was clearly in distress, with torn clothes, tattoos covering her arms, and the haunted look of someone who had been living on the streets. She was the very definition of the lost sheep I was preaching about. And I watched in helpless agony as a wave of collective rejection washed over my congregation. No one spoke a harsh word. No one asked her to leave. But hundreds of eyes either slid past her as if she were invisible, or gave her a quick, dismissive glance before turning resolutely back to the front. No one got up to offer her a seat. No one offered a smile. She was a ghost in the house of God. After a long, painful minute, she quietly slipped back out the door, her desperate search for sanctuary ending in the cold confirmation of her own unworthiness. The moment the door clicked shut, the organ swelled, and the congregation I loved rose to its feet, singing with gusto about how they were a shelter in the time of storm. The irony was so profound, it felt like a physical blade twisting in my soul. I turned my being toward Jesus, my spirit broken. The sorrow in his presence had now been joined by a pain that felt like a personal wound, a betrayal. "This is not what I taught," his voice resonated, not with anger, but with the heartbreaking grief of a rejected lover. "They use my name, Samuel, but they do not know my heart. They have taken the house I built to be a hospital for the broken and turned it into a museum for the righteous. They sing of my love and then use my name to bolt the doors against those I long to hold." As the weight of Jesus' indictment of the church settled upon me, a final, desperate line of defense rose in my spirit. "They have failed, Lord, yes," I thought. "But I have tried. I have given my life to you." It was the last gasp of a pride I didn't even know I possessed. The sorrow in Jesus' presence deepened, not in anger, but in the tender grief of a surgeon who must cut to the bone to save a life. Gently but with inescapable firmness, he turned the unsparing mirror of truth from my congregation onto me. The vision shifted, and I was ripped from the celestial realm and plunged back into my own past. I was standing in the narthex of my church 5 years ago. A teenager, the son of one of our elders, lingered after the service, his eyes shadowed with a pain I was too self-important to see. I was on my way to a regional council meeting where I was scheduled to speak, and I could feel the familiar, impatient tug of my own agenda. The boy tried to talk, stammering about questions and confusion. I relived the moment with horrifying clarity. I placed a firm, pastoral hand on his shoulder, offered him a well-rehearsed platitude about faith in troubled times, and pressed a pamphlet into his hand before striding away, feeling I had done my duty. But this time I didn't stride away. I was forced to inhabit his experience. I felt the hope wither in his chest as he watched my retreating back. I felt the crushing weight of his unspoken confession, a crisis of faith, a struggle with depression, and the sting of being dismissed by the one man he thought would understand. He didn't need a pamphlet, he needed a shepherd, and I had been too busy being an important clergyman to notice. The scene dissolved and reformed. I was in my car, driving home after a sermon on humility that had been met with a standing ovation. Jesus showed me not my actions, but my heart. I felt the secret, intoxicating thrill of the congregation's praise. I tasted the subtle poison of pride as I replayed their compliments in my mind, savoring them. He showed me that in that moment, the applause of men had become a sweeter sound to me than the quiet whisper of the Holy Spirit. My sermon on humility had been a monument to my own arrogance. I had been worshiping my own reflection in the eyes of my flock. Then the final, most devastating vision. I was in my office counseling a young couple. The wife was weeping, confessing a deep personal failing. I watched myself listen with a compassionate expression, quoting scriptures about grace. But Jesus peeled back the veneer and showed me the truth lurking in my heart. I felt a cold, subtle current of judgment flowing from me toward the woman. I saw her not as a wounded soul in need of grace, but as a moral failure, and though my words were kind, my spirit condemned her. And this time I felt what she felt, not the warmth of God's love, but the cold chill of my judgment, a barrier that made it impossible for her to receive the very grace I was talking about. The visions ended. I was back before Jesus, but the spiritual ground beneath me had been annihilated. The identity of Samuel Thorne, man of God, lay in ashes. My life's work, my service, my sermons, all of it was tainted. I saw with perfect, agonizing clarity that I was no different from the gossiping deacons or the congregation that shunned the visitor. I had preached a gospel that I myself had failed to live, not in dramatic, obvious ways, but in 1,000 small, daily betrayals of love. I was a clanging cymbal, a whitewashed tomb, a fraud. The realization didn't just humble me. It utterly crushed me, breaking me down to the very foundation of my being until nothing was left. In the silent, holy presence of Jesus, I had no words, only the single, soul-shattering truth that was left. I was not their judge. I was one of them. I knelt in the spiritual ruin of my own self-righteousness, utterly broken. It was in that place of absolute zero that the grace of Jesus met me, not with a lecture, but with a love so restorative it began to knit my shattered soul back together. His presence lifted me not to my feet, but to a new understanding. They have all forgotten Samuel, his voice resonated, no longer with sorrow, but with the clear, bright tone of pure truth. The politicians, the corporate titans, the divided church, even you. You have all forgotten my greatest and only commandment. I did not give them a religion. I did not give them rules to prove their righteousness. I gave them a single creative force to build a world of beauty. I gave them love. He explained that love was not a sentiment or an emotion. It was the fundamental operating system of the universe, the law of spiritual physics that held heaven together. And the world's suffering was the direct result of humanity attempting to run on a corrupt, broken code of its own design: fear, greed, and pride. Now look, he commanded, and a new vision formed. I saw a man in a squalid, dark room, his hands shaking as he raised a bottle to his lips. His face was a roadmap of despair. "What do you see?" Jesus asked. "A drunkard," I answered, the worldly label coming instinctively. "An addict, a lost cause." Jesus peeled back the man's reality like the pages of a book. He showed me the terrified boy still hiding inside the man, a child who had been told he was worthless. He showed me the immense pain the man was trying to drown. "I see my son who is hurting," Jesus corrected me gently. "Love him." The sign changed. A teenage girl, the one who had been turned away from my church, sat huddled in a grimy bus station, her face a mask of defiance. "What do you say?" "A runaway," I said, angry, defiant, probably in trouble. Jesus revealed her heart to me. I saw her fleeing not toward trouble, but away from unspeakable abuse. Her anger was a shield, protecting the last embers of a spirit that had been systematically crushed. "I see my daughter who is terrified and alone," Jesus said. "Love her." One last vision, a man whose face was hard and cruel, a man I recognized as a notoriously ruthless businessman who had destroyed lives without a second thought. "And him, what do you see, Samuel?" "An evil man," I replied with more certainty than before. "A sinner, an enemy of your people." Jesus opened the man's soul to me, and what I saw made me recoil. It was a barren, lightless wasteland of profound self-loathing. His cruelty was a desperate, pathetic attempt to prove he existed, to make the world feel a fraction of the pain that consumed him every moment. "I see my son who is lost in the deepest darkness," Jesus said, his voice aching with pity. "Forgive him and love him." The visions faded, leaving me overwhelmed. "But Lord, how?" my soul cried out. "How is this possible? Their sin is so great. How can anyone love like that?" Jesus' answer was the final key, the truth that unlocked everything. "The same way I am loving you, Samuel, right now. In the full knowledge of your pride, your hypocrisy, and your failure. Do you say? The love I command is not a feeling you must muster. It is a reality you must enter. It is the act of seeing others the way I see you." In that moment, I understood. The same grace that was covering my own filth was the only grace I was meant to extend to others. It was that simple and that impossible. His expression grew urgent, his voice taking on a new, solemn intensity. "You must go back and tell them. They must choose to live this way, and they are running out of time." He made me feel it then, the spiritual trajectory of the world. I felt the immense, accumulating weight of humanity's hatred, division, and indifference, like a runaway train accelerating toward the edge of a cliff. "If they do not change," Jesus warned, "the world will suffer greatly. This is not a threat of my punishment. It is the inevitable harvest of the seeds they are sowing." The mandate was now clear, and its weight was terrifying. Go back. Tell them, show them. Before it is too late. I stood there, the terrible and beautiful weight of my mission settling into my soul. I had my orders, I knew what I had to do. But as I looked into the face of Jesus, into the source of all love and life, a grief so profound it threatened to unmake me washed over my spirit. How could I leave this? How could I walk away from this peace, this wholeness, this absolute reality, and return to a world of shadows and pain? To leave him felt like a second crucifixion, a tearing of the soul from its source. Every part of my being screamed in protest. The weight of my physical body, a memory I had almost forgotten, now felt like a death sentence. Lord, please, my soul cried out, a silent, desperate prayer. Please don't send me back, not yet, I can't leave you. He looked at me with an expression of infinite tenderness, an understanding that went deeper than my own. He knew the agony of this exile better than anyone. You will not remember everything at once, Samuel, he communicated, and his final words were both a comfort and a warning. It would be too much for your mind to hold. But the truth is now a part of you. In time, it will return. Before I could ask what he meant, I felt it. A force, gentle yet as undeniable as gravity, began to pull at me. It was a cosmic tide, receding from the shores of heaven and drawing me with it. I resisted instinctively, trying to anchor myself in his presence, trying to cling to the light. My heart, the spiritual heart that had been made whole, now felt like it was being torn in two. The beautiful, orderly reality of heaven began to stretch and distort around me, its light pulling away like a photograph being burned from the center out. I was being dragged backward away from home, pulled through a place beyond time and space. The transition was not a peaceful drift. It was a violent expulsion, a spiritual birth in reverse. I was being forced from a realm of infinite light, freedom, and love back into the dark, crushing confinement of the flesh. And then impact. Pain. A crushing, absolute, all-consuming pressure slammed into my chest, as if a mountain had materialized on top of me. It was the first, brutal law of my new reality. My lungs, which had breathed the very life of God, were now on fire, convulsing, choking, desperately trying to drag in air that felt as thick and abrasive as gravel. My skin was shockingly cold and wet, my limbs impossibly heavy, leaden weights shackled to my soul. I was back. The wholeness was gone, replaced by a symphony of agony. Through the fog of pain, the world of the senses began to bleed in, a chaotic and violent assault. I could hear voices, muffled and frantic, shouting meaningless, harsh sounds. I could feel hands on me, pressing hard on my chest, shaking me. My vision, when I could force my heavy lids to open, was a blurry, terrifying mess. There were shapes hovering over me, their faces distorted and strange. And then the lights, not the gentle, nourishing radiance of heaven, but brutal, stabbing flashes of red and blue that pierced my eyes and felt like a physical violation. The flashing lights of an ambulance, the shouts of paramedics, the cold mud of the ditch. With a ragged, tearing gasp that felt like it was ripping my throat open, I sucked in my first agonizing breath of earthly air. The messenger had been delivered. The days that followed were a study in dissonance. I was a ghost haunting my own life. My body was recovering at a pace the doctors called a miracle, a medical anomaly they couldn't explain. But my soul felt alien in a world that no longer made sense. Colors seemed muted and dull compared to the living hues of heaven. Food was tasteless ash in my mouth. The conversations of my loved ones, filled with unspoken anxieties and hidden meanings, felt clumsy and dishonest compared to the pure, telepathic communion I had known. I was an ambassador from a country no one else had seen, a country whose language I was already beginning to forget. Jesus' final words haunted me, "You will not remember everything at once." He was right. The high-definition clarity of the experience was already starting to fade at the edges, like a brilliant dream upon waking. In my sterile hospital bed, I would close my eyes and desperately try to recall the exact texture of the light, the precise timbre of the celestial music. The core message, the love, the warning that was branded onto my soul. But the details were slipping, and I fought to hold on to them, scribbling on notepads with a shaking hand, terrified that the most real thing that had ever happened to me would be dismissed by my own damaged brain as a hallucination. The day I was discharged, I gathered my family. My wife, bless her, held my hand as if she was afraid I might fade away. My children, now grown with families of their own, looked at me with a painful mixture of relief and deep concern. They were expecting a promise to slow down, to retire. Instead, I gave them the truth. I told them everything, my voice raw and halting as I recounted the visions, the message, the profound, crushing weight of my own failures. My wife didn't question the details, she just wept, looking into my eyes and saying, "Something is different." The man who left that morning didn't come back. She believed not in the story, but in the transformation she saw in the storyteller. My youngest son, however, shook his head, his face a mask of loving concern. "Dad," he said softly, his voice careful not to offend. "You were clinically dead, no oxygen to the brain for minutes. The mind does strange things. Maybe it was just a dream, a powerful one." I wasn't angry. How could I be? He was trying to anchor me to a reality I no longer belonged to. "It was more real than this is," was all I could say, and I felt the first true pang of the messenger's loneliness. The following Sunday, I stood again in my pulpit. But I was no longer a pastor preparing to deliver a polished sermon. I was a witness called to the stand, sworn to tell the whole, terrifying, beautiful truth. I looked out at the familiar faces, and with a voice that broke a dozen times, I told them. I told them that I had died. I told them about the love that holds the universe together. And then I told them about the visions. I spoke of the hypocrisy I had seen in our own church, and of the pride and judgment I had discovered in my own heart. I wasn't preaching at them, I was confessing alongside them. The reaction was immediate and seismic. A fissure ran down the center aisle of my church. On one side, people were weeping, their faces broken open with conviction. An elderly woman in the front row stood up, her voice trembling, and said, "Pastor, I believe you, and I have been living wrong." Others followed, confessing long-held grudges and hidden sins. But on the other side of the aisle, there was a stony, uncomfortable silence. Arms were crossed. Skeptical glances were exchanged. A few families quietly stood up and walked out before I had even finished. When I gave the benediction, I was speaking to a congregation that had been irrevocably broken in two. Later that evening, I sat alone in the vast silence of the empty sanctuary. The elation of survival was long gone, replaced by the cold, heavy reality of my mission. My old life, the life of a respected and beloved pastor, was over. I was now something else, a messenger with an impossible burden, a fool who had been tasked with convincing a blind world of the existence of color. I had seen heaven and I had been warned. The work wasn't done. It had just begun. The weeks turned into months, and the world I had returned to did not slow its frantic race toward the edge of the cliff. The urgency Jesus had placed in my soul became a constant, pressing weight. With every news report of another war, another political feud, another story of division and hatred, I could feel the spiritual momentum of the world accelerating down the wrong path. The memory of heaven was my constant companion, a beautiful and agonizing standard against which I measured every waking moment. My church was fractured. Many had left, unable to accept the testimony of a man they now considered broken or delusional. But a core remained, smaller, humbler, and more on fire than I had ever seen them. We were no longer a social club, we were a field hospital. Our mission boiled down to the simple, impossible task of loving the world as Jesus had commanded. My own mission expanded beyond those familiar walls. I was no longer just a pastor. I was a messenger, and the message was not just for those who already sat in the pews. I spoke wherever I could, in schools, in homeless shelters, on street corners, to anyone who would listen. I told them the truth of what I had seen. I told them that love is not a weakness, but the most powerful force in creation. I told them forgiveness is not an option, but a necessity for survival. I told them that every moment we spend in judgment and hatred is a moment stolen from the beautiful life we were designed to live. Some scoffed and turned away. Some called me a madman. But others wept. Others listened, others changed. And I knew that every single soul that chose to turn from the path of division was another brake applied to the world's runaway train. And now I plead with you, whoever you are, wherever you are, reading these words. My story is not meant to be a comfort, it is meant to be a fire alarm. Do not wait until your heart stops to understand what truly matters. Do not waste another precious day of your life holding on to bitterness, nursing grudges, or building walls between you and your brothers and sisters. Do not let the world convince you that power, pride, or being right is more valuable than the simple, world-altering act of choosing to love. You are at a crossroads. Humanity is at a crossroads. The kingdom of heaven is real. I have seen its glory, and I promise you, it is worth everything. But the choice to bring a fragment of that kingdom into this broken world, to reflect its light in your own life, that choice is yours, and you must make it now. You are running out of time. The love of Jesus is the answer to every wound, the balm for every sorrow, the light for every darkness. He has given every single one of us the capacity to be a conduit for that love, to be his hands and feet on this suffering earth. The only question that has ever mattered is the one that is before you right now. Will you choose it? Because this is no longer just my mission. It is now yours. It is ours. Love one another as I have loved you.